The great doors of the Black Gate swung back wide. The captains of the west rode back, and from the host of Mordor there went up a jeering yell. The men of the west were trapped, and soon, all about the grey mounts where they stood, forces 10 times and more than 10 times their match would ring them in a sea of enemies. Upon one of the hills stood Aragorn with Gandalf, and there, fair and desperate, was raised the banner of the Tree and Stars. The wind blew and the trumpet sang. The fate of Middle-earth was about to be decided. It's the 16th March in the 3019th year of the Third Age. The townlands of Pelennor is covered with fallen warriors and beasts. Against all odds, the force of the West managed to claim victory against the legions of Morgul. Minas Tirith is weary but awake, and there are already rumors spreading through the city of a king that turned the tide of the battle, and that he masters both war and healing. Meanwhile, in the Tower of Barad-dûr, the doubt of Sauron is growing. The siege of Gondor had been a disaster for the Dark Lord. His lieutenants had perished, and the fortune of war had turned against him. However, his greatest concern is the return of Isildur's heir. The Lord of Mordor also knows that his precious ring is in the hands of his enemies, and here lies his greatest distress. He fears the terrible Lord Aragorn could become if he decided to utilize the power of the One Ring. Sauron's mind is now fixed upon Minas Tirith and Aragorn's next maneuver. Simultaneously on the field of Pelennor, the captains of the West now debate their next move. Gandalf the White, emissary from the West, reminds the captains of Denethor's vision in the Palantir, that victory cannot be achieved through the strength of arms. The force of the West had barely managed to beat off the first great assault, and the next would be even greater. Hope was bound to the fate of the One Ring, for if it was destroyed from whence it came, Sauron would perish, and his armies would rout and despair. In wisdom, or in great folly, the ring had been sent with the Ringbearer to the heart of Mordor. Gandalf advised the captains to make themselves the bait for Sauron, to draw attention away from anything else, and thus to give the Ringbearer a frail hope. It might be that they would perish, but they saw this as their duty and only hope to save the West from Sauron's oppressing rule. Gandalf spoke urgently against assailing Minas Morgul, for the evil that lurked there would turn the minds of men to madness and horror. It had also been told by Faramir that the Ringbearer had taken this route, and thus it would be against purpose to draw the attention of Sauron in this direction. The Morannon was therefore chosen to be assailed. The debate was ended, and 7,000 should contest the power of Sauron in front of the Black Gate. At the same time as the last debate was held by the captains of the West, the Ringbearer and his servants gazed over the plains of Gorgoroth. There were armies as far as the eye could see. The path that they would venture was heavily occupied by the enemy. The brave hobbits continued their hopeless journey, and for some time they had luck on their side. But 2 days later, when they rested on the road leading towards the Karakangren, they heard a sound that they all along had feared. The noise of marching feet. The orcs were moving too fast for the hobbits to escape by flight along the road ahead. They could do little but wait, and it didn't take long. Their orc clothing covered their identities, but they were considered deserters and were forced into the line of war. This march became a living nightmare for the hobbits that was already exhausted. It all seemed in vain when they were approaching the Icenmouth, for their strength failed. But in this very moment, a troop of Uruks charged into the line. This caused confusion in the ranks, and Samwise saw his opportunity and dragged Frodo with him. They had escaped in the nick of time. At the same time as the Ringbearer and his servant had been overtaken by orcs, the army of the West marched out from Minas Tirith. The captains had not been idle, and they soon got news from scouts that there were no enemies present on the road. A host of orcs and Easterlings had turned back to Anorion, but had quickly been scattered by the Rohirrim and retreated towards Cair-Andros. Another undefeated host of Mordor was still present in the north, but the city of Minas Tirith was now manned by forces from the southern fiefs, and Rohirrim cavalry guarded the west road. Thus, all now was ready, and the host started their perilous journey. The next day, the host broke the bridge leading to Minas Morgul and set aflame the noisome fields and departed. Yet, they still left a force of rangers of Ithilien to prevent Mordor from sending forces through Minas Morgul. The army marched onwards, and the heralds announced the return of King Elessar and his claim to the fair land of Ithilien, but none answered the call. The army marched on for 2 more days, and then came the ambush. Easterlings and orcs attacked the leading companies, but the ambushers became the ambushed. Aragorn had been warned by the skilled rangers, and the Rohirrim cavalry surrounded the ambushers and destroyed them and drove them to the eastern hills. Little comfort was this victory to the lords of the west, and men became more disheartened for every step they took towards the haunted Morannon. The presence of the Nazgul made it even more terrifying, and the host had now finally entered the desolate land of Dagorlad. The desolation and horror of this terrorized land were too much to bear for some men, and they managed not to march any further. Aragorn looked at them not with anger, but with pity. He gave them their leave, but he encouraged them to attempt to retake Cairandros. Men saw the mercy of their new lord, and some overcame their fear. Others found new hope and marched towards Cairandros. The army camped at the terrible plain. Wolves howled, and many things half-seen walked and prowled about them, and they found no sleep. They were now coming to the last end of their folly, and stood before the towers and walls which their army could not assault with hope. There was no army to be seen, and they could feel the chill wind from the north. Aragorn now prepared a host for the inevitable, and drew them up on 2 great hills surrounded by mires. When all was ordered, the captains rode to the Black Gate with a great guard of horsemen. There was Gandalf, the enemy of Sauron, and Aragorn, Isildur's heir. And the sons of Elrond came, and Eomer of Rohan, and Imrahil. And Legolas, Gimli and Pippin came also, so that all the enemies of Mordor should have a witness.
Let the Lord of the Black Land come forth!
The heralds cried, and the trumpets were blown. There was a long silence. From wall and gate, neither cry or sound was heard in answer. The captains were about to leave, but then came the drums like thunder in the mountains, and then a braying of horns that shook the earth. And then the embassy of the Black Tower approached. The lieutenant of the Tower of Barad-dûr, the mouth of Sauron. The Black Númenorian scoffed at Aragorn, but Isildur's heir just looked him in the eyes. Here, 2 remnants of Númenor held the gaze, but the lesser quailed. Then came the sting that broke the captains.
Dwarf coat, elf folk, blade from the downfall west, and spy from the little ratland of the Shire.
The demands for the release of the Hobbit were listed, but they were refused, and the mouth of Sauron was filled with wrath and left. The great doors of the Black Gate swung back wide. The captains of the west rode back, and from the host of Mordor there went up a jeering yell. The men of the west were trapped, and soon, all about the grey mounts where they stood, forces 10 times and more than 10 times their match would ring them in a sea of enemies. The wind blew, the trumpet sang, and the arrows whined. The Nazgul approached on their fell beasts, crying voices of death. The orcs could not yet access the enemy because of the mires, but the hill trolls of Gorgoroth made way and came crashing into the ranks of the west. With their giant hammers, they broke upon the line of Gondor as smiths hewing the hot-bending iron. The orcs released volley upon volley with arrows, and then charged on all fronts. Easterlings and Southrons were terrible, and filled with wrath. The will of Sauron was fixed upon the host, and it drove his servants with lust and power. It looked very grim for the west. But then came the eagles out of the sky. They stooped towards the Nazgul, but the fell beasts turned and fled, and vanished into Mordor's shadows. hearing a sudden terrible call out of the dark tower. At that moment, all the hosts of Mordor trembled, and doubt clutched their hearts, for the power that drove them on and filled them with hate and fury was wavering, and its will was removed from them. Then all the captains of the West cried aloud, for their hearts were filled with new hope in the midst of darkness. It was in this very moment that Frodo Baggins claimed the One Ring for his own in Sammath Naur, in the very heart of the realm of Sauron. And here at the cracks of doom, Gollum managed to recover his precious. But in his triumph, he stepped too far and fell with a shriek. Into the fire he fell, and was never seen again. There came a drumming rumble, a roar, long echoing roll of ruinous noise. The towers of Thieves swayed and fell down, and the Black Gate was hurled in ruin. A great shadow crowned with lightning, filling all the sky, passed above them, and it was all blown away. Orcs and trolls alike lost their minds, and slew themselves, or cast themselves into pits. The men of Rhûn and Harad fled towards their homelands, but those longest in the servitude of Sauron now prepared for their last stand. Into Mordor flew Gwaihir Windlord with Landroval and Meneldor, and there the Ringbearers were saved from the wrath of Orodruin and brought to safety. The remaining forces of Mordor had finally been subdued after a great resistance, and the men of the West celebrated their fortune. Thus ended the realm of Sauron, and thus the line of kings was renewed. If you are interested in lore from Tolkien's Legendarium, make sure to check out these videos right here. Remember to subscribe and consider supporting me on Patreon to show your support.